a big piece of it for me was learning from my students and having the orientation of what student voice scholar Michael Fielding calls radical collegiality. And so seeing students as my colleagues was a huge shift for me, and needed to one, overcome the power inequity that was present in a variety of ways, just systemically. And that plays out in the classroom.
School is in. But are you really ready to learn? Open your eyes to a new day in education with The Awakening Educator, a program specifically designed to explore a new, mindful way of educating our youth. Learn about social-emotional learning, new modalities of teaching, and the most relevant topics in education with your hosts, Susan Andrian and Megan Sweet. Susan and Megan will take you inside the issues by looking at them from different points of view, from policies and research to teaching models that are actually used in schools. There's never a dull moment in this classroom. Have any questions you'd like to ask? Maybe you have knowledge you'd like to share, and share your thoughts live on air. Grab a pen and paper and get ready to open your textbooks and minds to a new way of learning on The Awakening Educator.
Now we're doing it.
Awesome.
Okay, everybody. Hello. Welcome. This is Megan Sweet. And I was not recording the first time. So hi, everyone. This is Megan Sweet, and welcome to The Awakening Educator. My co-host Susan is out sick today, so it's just me here on the screen. And I'm so excited to have Lindsay Lyons with us, who will be talking with us about teaching and leading with equity. And so welcome, Lindsay, to the show.
Thank you, Megan. So happy to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background, Lindsay?
Yeah, sure. So I guess kind of back before I even became a teacher, the joke is that I always said I wanted to be anything but a teacher. And so my parents are both teachers, and I was like, I went through all the things: photographer, lawyer, like anything I could think of that was like not a teacher. And then about 2 months before graduating undergrad, I found the New York City Teaching Fellows program and decided I want to become a teacher. And so I taught for 7 years in New York City public schools. For the last 3 was full-time in a PhD program in leadership and change, and then transitioned to coaching, did some subcontracting, worked for the state of Massachusetts in turnaround schools, worked for some different organizations around educational leadership and student voice, and published a little bit, and then realized I really wanted to start my own business and really niche down into 2 areas that I now focus in, which are, one, on the teaching for justice side, thinking about curriculum development and how do we not just kind of sprinkle in, justice into an existing curriculum that might be unjust at the core, but how do we design with justice in mind and equity in mind? And then for leaders, thinking about how do we share leadership and how do we see students and family members, teachers as all these stakeholders as leaders, and how do we give positional power and authority in terms of the conversation around policymaking to those stakeholders.
It's awesome, Lindsay. I feel like you're like my sister from another mister, and whatever you want to say around that in terms of like our professional trajectory. Although I always wanted to be a teacher. I was a teacher for 10 years and then got a doctoral degree focused on change management. My lens was on finance reform, using finance reform as the change lever, but change management as like understanding that. Spent a lot of time with turnaround schools. I turned one around myself, and then did coaching and leading around turnaround schools in California here. And I really deeply believe, equity is at the core of my work, but so there's that, but also actually really deeply believe in community engagement and bringing forward parent and student voices and community voices in our school designs, because each school is so personal and individual. So while we need to have systems and things that have some continuity across, I get that. I generally am the one that shows up and like, look, you can't have all the bells and whistles. We need some continuity. I'm the first one that does that. However, there are a lot of ways that we really need to customize our educational settings so that they feel empowering and inclusive of our communities that we're serving. So I just really appreciate the work that you're doing. I know it's also often very hard work, but also really fun. And for me, it's really deeply fulfilling to go in and support schools to do that kind of re-envisioning. So I'm so excited that you're here. I feel like we could geek out on any number of change management things. One thing that you shared though, that I wanted to ask you about right off the bat, because I feel like there's this growing interest, and it's good and needed, of like, oh, okay, our curriculum materials are inherently reflection of white supremacist culture and ideologies, and they're not inclusive. We've known this for many years, but I feel like there's like a more shared understanding that like our testing system, our educational system, automatically from the very beginning sets up students and families from color, students and families that aren't from or aren't a part of the culture of power, white supremacist culture of power in the United States, to have challenges. And so it's exciting to see that there's a lot more common understanding and motivation to make that change. And I wonder how you go about it, because curriculum adoptions are actually, most people probably don't know this because they think you just go to a bookstore maybe and pull a book off the shelf and that's the curriculum you use in your school or district. And it actually is generally a lengthy process, often over a year. It's extremely expensive. And I don't know, and I think often folks don't know where to find that information. So how do you go about starting to look at the curriculum side around equity and social justice?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, such a good question. So my approach is one that is somewhat unpopular. So I will caveat that. But I have found in my own teaching that one of the things that really worked for my students was co-creating with them and really getting to know them, figuring out what they're interested in, asking the question of what do we want to learn this month or in this unit, or, what's an exciting question? If I throw out 5 questions, which ones do we want to pursue? And maybe all 5, and different students are pursuing different ones. And so I think it's really personal to the teacher and the class that you're in, which takes a lot of time up front, creating that curriculum. But for all the reasons that you said about like the process of looking at existing curriculum, the amount of time it takes to go through them all, and also curriculum implementation, usually to do it well, 3 to 5 years, and so if we are realizing 3 to 5 years from now, oh, we chose a curriculum that doesn't work, well, okay, now what? So I love the process and the idea of a process that really grounds the work in the teacher and the students in front of the teacher. And how do we co-create, and how do we get the principles of that curriculum design behind us and into the teachers and kind of toolbox, so to speak, so that we can do this in an ongoing way. And so that it's affirming of the identities in the class and the passions of the students and all of that. And so I really take a backwards design approach where I look at kind of what we're teaching, but also how we're teaching and how we're assessing. And so pulling in justice from all of those lenses, I think is really critical, because if we're teaching content that is awesome and justice centered, but we're doing it in a pedagogical way that is not justice centered and student centered, we have a problem. And then even if we're teaching content and teaching in a way that is justice centered and student centered, but we're grading in a way that is traditional and inequitable, then we still have a problem. And so trying to fuse all that stuff together is kind of the approach that I use.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant, Lindsay, because I think that's the challenge we have. And I'm gonna push you on how you do that, because I immediately, in my mind always goes to like, great, and then how do you do it? But what I love about what you shared there is, number one, books alone or curriculum alone aren't, they're not going to be the panacea that solves our problems. We've tried this before in education, educator people in education land out there. We know this doesn't work. Curriculum is one part of that process. But you're right. Grading is a whole nother one. And I'm excited to see that grading is finally becoming something that people are seeing more, and understanding that grading has also created a lot of barriers for students and families of color, English learners, students with special education services, kids that are low income, actually all kids. So it's a barrier and a problem. And then also finally, I think you named that teachers are actually the central part of that. The way that teachers hold and create safe spaces in classrooms, I believe, is probably one of the most fundamental ways that we can make or break any kind of student's learning experience. You can have a great curriculum, you can have a great grading system, and if you have a teacher that is, and I'm going to say, my assumption is, I assume positive intent for the most part. So my assumption is that most educators that are creating classrooms that are not culturally, rich or inclusive aren't doing so to cause harm. It's out of lack of knowledge or awareness. haven't done the work or don't have the awareness around the microaggressions that might be happening in their classrooms or other ways that they're creating spaces that are unsafe for kids. So you're right. So I think teachers are the key. And it's something that I talk about in my work as well. And we need to train teachers to not only be able to think differently about how they teach, but also have that self-awareness of the thoughts that are in their head, their quick assumptions that they might be making. Any kind of, unexamined assumptions or biases that might be there, but also then having the facility and the comfort to lead conversations with kids, which is where I think often our progress towards infusing more race and equity in our classrooms, that's where it stops. Because talking about race, discussing equity and the profound inequities in our country, it's uncomfortable work. And you have to be fairly comfortable with that. I can't think of a better word than comfortable. And you need to be really skilled. So that was a big lead up to how do you train teachers in this? And, do you have any sense of so what's an approach that you would do to go about training teachers around addressing equity in this way?
Yeah. Okay. So I have two kind of paths for that answer. And one is the curriculum design approach. And so that's a lot of my work. And then I partner a lot with Dr. Cherie Bridges Patrick, who is diving into, so her background is in racial discourse and how do we cultivate like a class or a space, and even in workspaces that is, I want to use choose these words wisely, because she's doing some really interesting things with safe spaces and problematizing the idea of safe spaces. Mm-hmm. So she uses a kind of neuroscience somatic approach to thinking about how we co-regulate as teachers. We co-regulate with students. And so if our nervous systems are, if we're not in touch with our nervous systems, if we can't handle how our bodies are responding and be in tune with that, how are we going to help students regulate their own stuff, right? And so I think with that is the interesting idea she's introduced me to, that we can't create spaces that are decidedly safe for everyone, because everyone's sense of safety is like their own perception. And so that is just a fascinating mindset shift for me. It's like, oh, right. So I can't declare this safe space. I can do as much as I possibly can to help people feel safe in the space, but they're bringing all sorts of stuff with them. And I'm putting off all sorts of energy in the way that I'm even physically standing and my face, all these things. Mm-hmm. So that is such a complex set of things that it goes into, the training. And she has a whole process for that I'm just starting to learn about, which really, as you said, starts with the self, right? So it's interrogating the ideas that we hold, the beliefs that we hold, but it's also about like, how do we even connect with our own sense of, what is dangerous or not? So our system, our nervous system scanning for safety and looking for connection, and how are we processing that, or how are we disconnected from that, which is, as I said, not my wheelhouse, but super fascinating stuff. And then on my side of things, I do a lot of, the curriculum planning design approach. And so I pull in a lot of different theory from a lot of different places. And I love things that are practical. And so I try to find these tools that are really practical. So one thing I start with is, what are the core standards? What are the priority standards that we want to address? And I encourage people to choose 4 to 8 for the entire year. So for an entire course, if you can only hit 6 standards, for example, what are they? And the reason for this is, one, it's easier to plan and get clear on your planning as a teacher, but it's also good for students to see, okay, these are the really high leverage skills. I'm going to practice them again and again. And so when we look at it from a grading standpoint, we're giving formative feedback. We're not necessarily grading with a number or a letter. And we're giving opportunities to revise and resubmit. So a lot of times we do, an essay, we get the red marks on the paper, and then it goes in the trash bin, and that grade is permanent. Whatever they got. So trying to undo that process, I think, is huge. And choosing the priority standards in a way that centers criticality, justice, the things that we're really trying to teach for. And so I get the idea of criticality from Dr. Goldie Muhammad's 4 Pursuits. And I've seen her playing with a 5th pursuit of joy, which I think is fascinating. And so I think that's another piece. After identifying the priority standards, asking those questions that she asks. And I specifically lift up identity and criticality, because I think those are 2 that are often overlooked more than her ideas of skills and intellectualism. I think those are pretty standard for a lot of classes. But centering students' understanding of themselves and others as identity is huge. How can we do that? That's a question we should be asking of every unit we create. And then criticality, how do we advance justice? How do we act as agents of change and teach students that, they have the ability and the agency to change, and just help them find the tools that they personally have, to go advance that change. And from there, I really think I help teachers think about a summative task, driving question that's really engaging and fun to answer, and then building out the lesson level with something that I call a unit arc, which is basically just the same pattern of activities for each unit. And you just reuse that pattern of activities. You don't need to spend hours and hours coming up with lesson plans every day. You know what that unit arc looks like, and then you just repeat it from unit to unit, substituting the new content for the unit.
Yeah, and that creates so much great continuity for the kids. I discovered that as a teacher, and it was just the most amazing thing. Like once I had that, it helped me to organize my thinking. I mean, it sounds like a lot of what you're talking about around the lesson design, the lesson planning, and the mapping is really, I mean, you and I both, I think, have a similar background around like systems change kind of stuff. So it's really around identifying priorities and focusing on those and using those as the anchors to drive the rest of the work. Which to me, it feels I feel like I can breathe better when you look at, you have 50 standards to hit and you don't know when you're going to do them, but like, it's really hard to focus. And actually then your instruction isn't as focused. So I love this idea of actually focusing on the priority ones, the ones that you're really going to make sure you're knocking out of the park. The other ones can come along for the ride. They can be in the back seat or whatever. But they're not the ones that are driving the instruction. And I think that's just a really important distinction that unfortunately and I've done that kind of mapping that you're talking about. Not every educator has had the opportunity to identify that, nor to have the training on how to have a whole unit arc. So I love that. The other thing you said, which made me smile and of course appeals to me, and I have been promising to mail you my book, and it's been sitting in my bag for 3 weeks. So I've been thinking about you for 3 weeks, Lindsay, as I carry the book around. So when it's really tattered and it gets to you, it's just because it's been in my bag. But in my book, I talk a lot about what you're talking about here and what your partner does. And I just came from a mindfulness organization. So this idea of our nervous systems being in the intervention is profound. And I often actually talk about that specific topic as well. And what I bring it back to for educators that maybe that sounds too out there is we all have and experience the truism of when we're in a bad mood, everything goes south in our classrooms right away. I remember discovering that, I don't know, I was 23, 24 years old, and I'd woken up on the wrong side of the bed. And I was like, there's nowhere to go when you're in a bad mood and you're a teacher, like you're still with your kids. You don't get to like work from home that day or cancel your meetings there in front of you. And I remember I'm a white identified woman. I don't know if you are, but I
am.
You are. Okay. I think that actually the work in education needs to really be driven by white identified women primarily because we're the largest population of people that are in the education system. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to that, because part of what our job is, in my belief, is actually to work people from our identity a little bit out of the job or, make space for others, because we need more diversity. We need far more male and different identities than white in our classrooms, but the majority is still white across the country. So I'm wondering your thoughts as a white identified woman in the education system. Where do we go with that?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Such a good question. So, and also I want to contextualize. So I grew up in an area that was almost exclusively white. I mean, just very white, rural, upstate New York area. I taught in the Bronx for 3 years and Manhattan for 4 years. And those 4 years in Manhattan, I was at a school with students who were all immigrant students to the country, recently immigrated in the last 4 years, over 50 countries, over 30 languages. And so I, like, identity wise, connected very little in terms of race, in terms of language, in terms of nation with my students. And so that was really important for me to recognize. And I think each year I learned a little bit more. I'm still, of course, learning. I think we're all constantly on a journey, but I think that was really big for me in terms of my understanding of my whiteness and how that played out in the class. The dynamics of that, I think, really evolved from my first year to, my last year. And as I said, I'm continuing to do, but I think that's one of the things that, looking back, that the biggest learning has really been really looking at all of the layers of identity that play out in a student teacher relationship. And so the power dynamics of student teacher is already present in just the roles that we inhabit in the class. So having things like lecture, having things like rules identified by the teacher that are then just, you have to follow this as a student, that gets into all sorts of problematic stuff when we think about the assumptions of behavioral norms stemming from white folks. And, there's so much there to unpack. And I think I was able to unpack that a little bit more each year, to the point where I was finally realizing I'm not the one who should be deciding what our class agreements are. I'll have a voice, as will all of my students. We will sit in a circle where we're all sitting, where we all have a chance to speak equally and equitably. And the students have, out of 30 speaking opportunities, 29 of those speaking opportunities, and they're going to let me know, what feels right. And so I think a big piece of it for me was learning from my students and having the orientation of what student voice scholar Michael Fielding calls radical collegiality. And so seeing students as my colleagues was a huge shift for me, and needed to one, overcome the power inequity that was present in a variety of ways, just systemically. And that plays out in the classroom, certainly. But then also kind of at the level of modeling for other white teachers, what this can look like. When I talk to educators as a coach, and of course I didn't do it perfectly, but I try to, give some examples of what could be possible, because I think when we go to teacher school and we're told this is the way that you be a teacher, right? You don't smile until Christmas. You don't do all of these things, right? I think there's so many things to unpack there, and so much fear, especially from new teachers. I mean, in all teachers, of, well, what does that actually look like if you give up control and that kind of thing? And so I think being able to push a little bit within your class, talking to other people about pushing within their classes, and then also the additional layer of existing in a school system that is inherently problematic for a variety of reasons, one of which, for example, is the dress code, right? So the dress code is inherently racist and sexist in the way that we perform it, and the way that we enact it, in the way that we take kids out of classes for not complying with it, the way that we omit students from having a conversation and families from having a conversation about what it should be. So I think there's all these layers to that. And so I guess my role as a white identified woman is someone who is really trying to expand my own understanding of what that means in a class relationship with my students, with a relationship with other teachers in my building and outside of my building, and then also what it means to push against those systems developed by white people that are oppressive, and push against the policies and push for better policies.
Yeah, that's really great. I appreciate what you named there, especially around the modeling. So I think teachers learn so much from each other, and we can talk about it all day long, but educators in general, and I learned this with, I mostly coach principals and executive leaders, and they're the same, which is actually my PhD is not so impressive to anybody. They want to hear, rightfully so, from their peers that are also doing the same work that they're doing. And it's just a really powerful place to learn, and taking the risk to model that and to talk with our peers, I think is a really fundamental and important way that we can start to shift this, what's happening in our classrooms and schools for students and families. So I'm really excited to hear that you're doing that. And yeah, your story of coming from a primarily white, suburban location and going to an urban one where the identities of the students are really different than your own, also very much parallels a lot of our education system. And actually, I want to say the name, like Teach for America or other groups that like intentionally plunk people that don't have the shared, not with any nefarious intent, but have a history of plunking people into spaces where they don't really match the identities. And, then we're learning on, with kids who don't have a minute to waste. And it's just a really painful dynamic. And I think it's important just to start to have the conversation around how to shift things. Led by white people doing our work, understanding what we need to do, and working with one another, in addition to conversations around race and equity, which is where I think we all tend to go, but learning to talk with each other, interrogate our work, and engage with trusted peers around ways we can improve our practice is just a really profound and important way to do it. So I really appreciate you naming all of those things. If you could change anything in teacher education programming, as we imagine this next group of, I mean, every year we have a new batch of educators coming out, and actually we need to train a lot of people because the education system, as I'm sure you well know, is struggling to keep teachers. What would you do differently, or what would you add in?
Oh my gosh, there's so many things. I think this could be like an hour-long conversation in itself, but I think one thing that I've always said, so my background was in my undergraduate degrees, because they weren't in teaching, were in sociology and gender women's studies. And I have always said that I think at least one course of intersectional feminism or, racial justice or something should be present for all teachers, at least one course. And I mean, I honestly believe there should at least be a minor requirement for some sort of justice-based minor that kind of complements teachers. I don't think that anyone, regardless of where you're teaching, would not benefit from that. And so that's just so, I think, critical for the type of schools that we want to be leading. If we want to maintain the status quo, we don't need those, but we're just going to continue the status quo. And I don't think that's what we're about. I don't think a lot of teachers get into teaching to maintain the status quo. I mean, I think we want to ultimately dream up a better system and live that out. And so I think that's one piece, is just having more formalized education around the pieces that we don't typically get unless you declare a major or minor in those areas. And so that should just be part of the teacher curriculum. And then the other piece, two other pieces. So one, I think, is trying to not teach like the teacher, I always call it like the teacher martyrdom, like the mindset of like, I have to be a martyr for my students, because no one ends up benefiting from that. I don't think teachers are burned out. And like you're saying, when you're having a bad day, that comes across and really amplifies issues within your classroom, because we need to be regulated as teachers. And I think some of that is this idea of, I need to be working 80-hour weeks. I need to be burning the candle at both ends. And then we see teachers leave the profession because they're burned out. And so I think coming up with a way that we do good work and we are effective teachers without burning out is critical. And so I think some strategies and some coursework around that would be really powerful, not just for teacher prep programs, but from the systems level for, I think, principal programs as well and administrative folks. But the other piece, I think, is curriculum design. If we gave everyone the tools to really design their own curriculum in a way that didn't feel unwieldy. Like I remember my curriculum design classes in my teacher prep program were just like, it was like an exercise in torture, because it was like this, like the level of detail required for like each lesson plan and the unit plan. And I ended up not using any of it when I actually got into my groove in curriculum designing, because I understood the principles and why we were doing it. But the literal writing down everything and the looking for ways that were finding ways myself that were more efficient than what I was taught took a really long time, and ultimately saved me more time, got me from working 80-hour weeks to 40-hour weeks, and was more effective with my students. And I was like, why couldn't we just teach this way, this more efficient, justice-centered way, where we're co-creating with students at the top? Like, and before I even got into a classroom, I think I would feel much more excited about curriculum, about designing new things, about trying new things, and about partnering with my students if I was taught how to do it, versus kind of figuring it out and figuring out what didn't work from my teacher prep program, which honestly was a lot of things, than when I, if I had it before I got into the program.
Yeah, I just feel like we have this like mind meld, Lindsay, and I'm so appreciative of it. Yeah, I think what you named were some really powerful skills, and I think at minimum a training on. I love that you brought feminism in there, and like in that background, especially since most women is like women in education as well. Like we should also know and understand our history and feel a little bit more empowered. I happened to go to Stanford to get my teaching credential a million years ago. And we did talk about race and equity then. And I didn't understand how revolutionary that was, especially, truly it was 27 years ago. So a very long time ago. And it totally shaped the trajectory of my instruction. Equity was at the center of our work. We talked about it a lot. So when I entered into the classroom, that was on my mind from day one. And I had at least a modicum of skills to be able to start to work towards creating a more equitable classroom. So I think I agree with you. I think that's fundamental. I also talk a lot and give talks all the time about don't kill yourself. Self-care is important. In fact, I'm even starting a little podcast called Self-Care in Seconds, because I think that educators feel like they don't have time for self-care, but actually walking away is fundamentally important. We do burn ourselves out. It is such a thing in our profession that, the martyrdom complex is so real. You're absolutely right. It's at every single level. I think it does start with teachers, because teachers often become the administrators and the superintendents and stuff down the line. And we carry those bad habits and mindsets all the way through with us. And actually it's rewarded, right? So the teachers that work exceptionally hard and are kind of seen as the hard workers often get the nod to have the first step in their leadership development, both within a school and then to become a principal. And then those hardworking principals generally get the nod for the next level within a district office, and on it goes. And so those people that are able to manage like the extreme amount of work that's required to be that person, set a really bad precedent for everybody else. They're not taking care of themselves either. And maybe they just don't understand that other people need that rest, as do they, whether or not they believe it. And as a recovered former extreme overworker, I could pull it off for years, and it does finally catch up with you at some point down the line. So I just really appreciate you naming that. And I love this notion of learning how to develop lessons with a lot of intentionality and understand how to do the prioritization you're talking about. Because I think we used to know how to do that, and I think we've lost it. So when I was a new teacher, we wrote every lesson. In fact, I didn't have textbooks. I feel like such a dinosaur as I'm talking, but like literally, I taught social studies. We didn't have a social studies textbook my first 3 years teaching. And so I had to write and we didn't have standards yet. So I had to write every single lesson by myself. I had a sense of what I was supposed to be teaching, but I kind of came up with it on my own. So I came up with my own arc, just like you talked about, for teaching social studies. That really helped me to feel grounded. And so for me, like creating your own lessons and being responsible in that way, that was how I taught school. But as I've been an administrator and watched the profession evolve since I've left the classroom, I think we've really taken the art of instruction out of teachers' hands in a lot of ways. And we're kind of leaving a lot of skills on the table when we do that, because educators are really innovative people and they have a lot to offer. And it's just much more fun and enjoyable when you're actually able to like create the instruction yourself. So I appreciate you naming that. I've been I haven't worked hard at it, but I have this like desire for us to infuse mindfulness, which is somewhat what you're talking about, into our teacher education and principal education programs, because I think is the same thing to me. That's the pathway to the embodiment and the self-awareness that you're talking about. So just some of those self-care strategies that are built in from the beginning, just to set the precedent that this is important and needs to be a part of your coping mechanisms and just kind of lifestyle strategy, especially for a job that's so on the line with everyone all the time. So inspired by all the work that you're doing, Lindsay, and I'm really excited to know that you're out in the world supporting schools to do this. If folks want to connect with you and want to work with you or know how to follow you and do all those things on all the places, how do they find you?
Yeah, so I have a podcast, and actually Megan was just on my podcast. So for people listening, you should check out her episode. So that's called Time for Teachership, and the intersection of teaching and leadership there, teachership. And nice. Then my website is lindsaybethlyons.com. Most platforms, everything except Twitter, I think I'm Lindsay Beth Lyons. Mm-hmm. And I believe you'll be sharing a free backwards planning template, the link in probably the show notes or something. Okay. So that's also an opportunity for people to just get that template for unit design that I kind of walked through. And so you'll see like what a sample unit arc looks like and all that stuff. So you can kind of jump into that if you're excited too.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. And I'll make sure I tweet it out and things like that when I send out the show. So that's really cool. Awesome. Thank you, Lindsay, for being with us. Like I said, so excited to have someone that, I'm biased because I feel like we think the same, but also I think these are the kinds of conversations we need to have in education. And I just love how your approach is to empower educators to have those skills themselves, because educators rock. They just need the support to be able to shine. So I'm so glad that you're doing that.
Absolutely. And this is such a fun conversation. I feel like we should definitely stay connected because we are totally in sync with all the things that we love.
Yeah, I love that. That'd be great. All right. Thanks, Lindsay. Thank you, everyone.
Class is dismissed. Wasn't that fun? Susan and Megan are always happy to greet you on the next episode of The Awakening Educator. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. Education is the foundation for a brighter future. Open your eyes to The Awakening Educator